There's really not much in Donald Trump that I like. It is purely a vote against Kamala Harris. I just think she should not be allowed to win.
Prior to 2020, I voted Libertarian in every presidential election of my lifetime. I think that's definitely not valid now with Donald Trump because he presents an actual threat to our elections.
The two candidates are so bad and so incapable of governing, and we're likely to end up with such a complete paralysis. Nothing will be done during the next 4 years. That isn't good.
This is Just Asking Questions, a show for inquiring minds on Reason.
Is this the most important election ever? And who should win? Just asking questions. Next week, America decides. Elect the 78-year-old, criminally indicted, twice-impeached ex-president who's pledged to impose a 20% across-the-board tariff and embark on the largest mass deportation in American history. Or his opponent, the vice president swapped in for a malfunctioning Joe Biden, whose first major policy proposal was to cap grocery store prices to fight inflation, and who has trouble explaining how she'd govern any differently than her increasingly unpopular predecessor. It's a close race. Independents, including libertarians, will likely decide it. So we've invited three of them on today with three different perspectives to explain their votes. The first is David Stockman. He's the former director of the Office of Budget Management under Ronald Reagan. He served as a U.S. representative. And he says, whoever wins, we're basically screwed because neither candidate is addressing the most important policy issues facing America today. Then we'll talk to Dave Smith, a repeat guest on the show, host of the popular Part of the Problem podcast, who says he's reluctantly and probably voting for Trump because of the threat that Kamala Harris and the political machine that she represents poses to liberty in America. And lastly, we'll talk with Jacob Grier, a writer and Reason contributor who says that from a libertarian and small government perspective, the choice is obvious. Donald Trump is an authoritarian threat, and Kamala Harris is a far superior choice. Now let's just ask each of them some questions. David Stockman, we're bringing you on to make the case, as you did in a recent Soho forum, which we'll post a link to, that both candidates represent, quote, the bottom of the policy dumpster. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you. And yes, we truly are at the bottom in this election, a few days away.
Yeah. And one question that we wanted to ask everybody, because you often hear that, it's like every election cycle you hear, this is the most important election ever. You need to get out and vote because whatever is on the line. I'm open to the idea that this year it's actually true, but I'm curious what your perspective is on that first.
Well, actually, on that,
the most important. Yeah.
No, actually on that, I don't think so. I've been voting every year since 1968. 68 was a big year. It was do or die on the Vietnam War, and where did you stand? I was anti-war. 1980 was important. That was Reagan and Carter. The year 2000 was important. 2016. I think the two candidates are so bad and so incapable of governing, and we're likely to end up with such a complete paralysis in our legislative process in Congress. Maybe the Republicans will win the House. The Senate. Maybe the House will end up in a stalemate like it is today. Nothing will be done during the next 4 years. That isn't good because the 4-5 big problems we have need to be addressed. On the other hand, I sort of like government that isn't doing anything. The genius of the founding fathers, the Madisonian contraption, as I call it, of checks and balances in our government, is that it's very hard for government to operate, to do things, to legislate, to make laws. And that's a good thing if you're a conservative or libertarian, because we want to have minimal government. So I think we'll have a mess. We'll have a shouting match. We'll have a lot of hysteria from Fox News on the one side and MSNBC and the rest of the mainstream media on the other. But somehow we'll get through it. It's not that important, but maybe we can learn a lesson. I was so disappointed when Robert Kennedy had to drop out. He was the alternative, a real alternative to the uniparty nonsense that we're hearing from both Trump and Harris. But unfortunately, they threw every roadblock imaginable in his way. I'm talking about the lawfare, operations of the Democratic National Committee. And he's chosen, I think, to endorse Trump as the lesser of two evils. I can't quite get that far. I think Trump has been so bad on fiscal issues, on fundamental economics, that I just can't, see my way clear to pull the lever at his behalf.
What did you like about RFK, by the way? Because he doesn't strike, there's certain things I like about him, but he certainly doesn't strike me as, a consistent small government, fiscal conservative type of guy, but maybe I'm missing something.
Well, two things. One, he understands the biggest problem we have in America today is the warfare state. The biggest problem we have is the global hegemony that Washington attempts to operate and impose from the banks of the Potomac, and that has to change drastically. He understands. I've talked to him about it quite frequently. The defense budget is obscene, $900 billion. It's the next 12 countries combined in the world when there's not a real threat to America's shores and airspace, and we have more than an adequate nuclear deterrent. So we could cut that by half, by $400 or $500 billion. That would start the process of bringing our fiscal house in order. So that's where I line up with him. Second, he understands that we can't keep borrowing at the rates that we're doing. $1 trillion every 3 months, every 4 months. We're at $36 trillion. Now, I've been around for a while, so I have a feel for something different than recency bias. Everybody says, well, it's a big number. It's been a big number for a long time. When I became budget director, which, I'm still here, so it's one lifetime, it was $1 trillion. So we've gone from, zero effectively to 36 in less than 40 years. But under existing law, the debt is going to go to 65 trillion by 2034, the next 10 years. And both candidates are pledging to pile on massively more. They've done a recent analysis, the Committee for Responsible Budget, which I guess is kind of an oxymoron because who's seen a responsible budget for several decades. But anyway, we priced out both candidates' programs. And Trump would add $10 trillion to the public debt over the next decade, and Harris $7.5 or $8 trillion. What are they thinking? We've already built in massive amounts of new debt that need to be addressed, but instead of addressing this ballooning debt, they're going to pile on more for every tax cut you can imagine, every kind of spending program that the Dems can think of. And frankly, Trump is almost as bad when it comes to defense spending, border control and other things. So I think neither candidate addresses what I call the 5 big issues that the public needs to have a choice on, and does not get a choice from the uniparty, as I call it, that runs Congress and that tolerates whoever they put on the ticket, in this case, the weakest candidates around, Kamala Harris and Trump. I want to just mention those 5. The warfare state, I've mentioned it, $900 billion, out of control, $1.3 trillion total spending for national security. The welfare state, no one will do anything about Social Security or Medicare or all the other entitlements. They're going to cost $50 trillion over the next decade. And, Trump has pledged not to touch either Medicare or Social Security, which is the heart of the matter. The soaring public debt we've talked about, we have all of this is made possible by what I call the rogue central bank that keeps printing money at fantastic rates. That's why we've had the inflation that we've had. And that's why Congress is so undisciplined. If the Fed is going to buy up all the debt and thereby artificially suppress interest rates, keep them low artificially because it's buying all the Treasury paper, well, then Congress is not going to get the message that you're harming the economy because sooner or later, the chickens are going to come home to roost. And then we have the border chaos. It sounds like there's a big split between the parties on that. Frankly, the Democrats want to pretend that they can write some kind of legislative solution, which is just another Washington scam, so that they can keep the border open and Democratic voters coming to America. The Republicans pretend that they're the champions of border security and integrity, but they would rather have an issue than address the underlying problem. The underlying problem is we're running out of workers in America, and we need to have a big guest worker program for low-skilled and unskilled workers. And if we had that and processed people that want to come here to work and live at our embassies, at our consulates all around Latin America and the world, there wouldn't be any chaos on the Rio Grande. And the Border Patrol could then enforce the border against the people that would actually be there, drug dealers, criminals, and so forth. Neither party wants to even address the need for a large scale, by that I mean 500,000 or 1 million a year workers who want to come here, work hard, pay taxes, support their family, and become good citizens.
Why do you think that is? Because it does make sense. It's always made sense to me on its face that if what we all basically want are peaceful and productive people to be able to come here and, keep out the criminals, keep out the dangerous threats, also, make sure our elections are secure so that people who aren't supposed to vote aren't voting, all that stuff is a given. But if you have a guest worker program, then you're by definition bringing people here who want to be productive members of the economy. Why is that a non-starter for both sides, do you think?
It's a good question because, see, if we had a guest worker program right now, it's kind of impossible to believe there's only 4,000 slots in our quota system. And we know quotas are bad. This is another big government program, but there's quotas for high-tech workers, for PhDs, for family reunification. But we have only a quota of 4,000 a year for low-skilled or unskilled workers. Now, let's say that we, expanded that to 500,000. What would happen? They would go to the embassy or the consulate in their own country. They would be vetted. Their backgrounds would be checked. If everything checked out and it became clear that they would become a productive worker and citizen in America, they would get a guest worker permit. And if not, they would be told, stay here and don't come to the border because you'll be arrested and put in jail. It's that simple. And why therefore, and we have all those bureaucrats, by the way. We have 200 consulates and embassies all around the world. One of the jobs they're supposed to do is vet people who want to come here. People don't know this, but every year that operation, that big State Department operation, approves 5 million visas for travelers and for green card applicants and other legal immigrants. That's how big the system is. That's how extensive and the institutionalized arrangement we have already. So if you took that great big system that can already do 5 million visas a year and added one more task of vetting and sifting out guest workers, we can solve a problem. But here's the issue. In the last 5 years, since September 2019, there has been a 1 million decrease in the number of native-born workers employed in the United States. A decrease. Now, why? It's not because they're discriminating against native-born workers. The reason is they weren't born. In other words, we've had such a low birth rate for decades and decades now that native-born workforce is actually shrinking. On the other hand, in the same 5-year period, we've had 4 million new workers join the labor force, all foreign-born. So these people who say that we have to put a wall up at the border, close it down, and so to speak, shoot on sight, have no idea of the economic implications. There is a way that we can address both. We can have a secure border, and we can augment our workforce, and by the way, get them paying taxes into the Social Security Fund to keep it solvent because it's heading for insolvency in the early 30s. We can do both if we had some semblance of rationality in Washington, which we don't. And Trump is really bad at this. He is a total unhinged demagogue who just makes stuff up like people eating dogs in Ohio and so forth, like cats. And the Democrats, they basically love the current system because they think the people coming in are going to vote Democratic. And why? Because a lot of the people that are coming in aren't workers. They're looking for a handout, and the Democrats are happy to provide it.
Yeah, let me ask you, let me try to anticipate what one of our subsequent guests might say about one of your critiques, because I think we can agree that the debt, we're all going to be in agreement that the debt is a huge problem. And just to bolster the point you were making, I've highlighted here what Trump's contribution to the debt was before. So if history is any guide, he's not going to bring this under control. As we know, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are a huge percentage of the annual outlays, and neither side wants to touch that. They've made that extremely clear to us. But the first item you listed there was the warfare state. And I've heard libertarians argue that Trump is far superior on this dimension because, first of all, he didn't start any new wars, which is, kind of a low bar, but it's a bar that previous presidents in my lifetime have not been able to pass. He also has not, the Democrats, Kamala Harris has surrounded herself by neoconservatives. She's embraced Liz Cheney. And Trump at least is showing some skepticism towards like this endless funding of the Ukraine conflict. And so on that dimension, which is a very important dimension to consider when you're voting for the commander-in-chief, Trump is superior. What's your reaction to that kind of argument?
Well, I think his impulses are correct. He talked about, America first and all that. But look what he did when he was in office. I'm a skeptic. When he was in office, he raised the defense budget from $600 billion to $800 billion. And it didn't need to be raised at all. When the generals came in and said, there are some bad guys in Syria that unleashed a chemical attack on their people, he said, okay, send in the bombers. Now, they say he didn't start any wars. He kept everything going. Not one base was closed. The defense budget went up. All the operations everywhere in the Middle East, in Yemen, in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean, all of the conflicts in the Far East. He would more likely get us into a conflict with China, a hot conflict, than would Harris, although they're both bad. So my only hope here is that he'll listen to Bobby Kennedy and give him a significant role in his administration. Because if Bobby Kennedy was at his elbow, I think there would be a totally different policy. But last time, who did he put at his elbow? All the neocons. It was a terrible slate. Yeah, anybody who appoints Bolton and, all the generals and Nikki Haley was, out of this world, insane neocon, war-loving, bloodthirsty. I don't know where she comes from. But to me, he's all talk and no action. And I agree, Kamala Harris is the worst. I call her lethal Kamala. She kept talking in the debate about how she was going to unleash lethal forces on anybody who doesn't obey Washington's commands. So, there's a lot of different issues, and maybe you could give Trump the nod on the margin. but it's not enough for me because I'm not sure he'll implement anything. And as a matter of fact, I mean, look what he did on Iran. They say that he didn't start any wars. The one good thing we had going in the Middle East was the nuclear agreement with the Iranians, and the first thing he did was, cancel it. And that's a real issue. If we got into a hot war with the Iranians,
one of their generals, right?
Oh my God! I mean, just in January 2020, Soleimani, I mean, who was like the leader and the national hero. I don't think the Iranians are great people, but I don't think they're any threat whatsoever. Zero. They don't have a blue water Navy. They don't have a long-range Air Force. They have no intercontinental missiles. So what the hell are they going to do to the United States? We should not be in a conflict with the Iranians. And Trump likely would get us into one because he'll do what, the Netanyahu forces of the world want him to do.
So you're making the case that Democrats and Republicans are a uniparty. You used that phrase.
Sure.
To push back on that a little bit, George Mason University economist Daniel B. Klein and his co-author Zachary Yost recently took that argument head on. They had an article here called "The Empirical Proof That the Uniparty Does Not Exist." And what they are arguing is that when you compare Republican to Democratic governance across all these different dimensions, and you make this little kind of scorecard, Republicans are just much better from a libertarian small government perspective. When you look at the regulatory state, welfare state, nanny state, labor and employment, on and on, Democrats win on things like drug liberalization and civil asset forfeiture. It's kind of a draw. So they
okay. I can if I can respond to that. I'm squinting at it on my screen. But the problem is it's weighing everything the same, and everything doesn't weigh the same. The big issue is the warfare state. The big issue is our interventionist foreign policy all around the world. And when you ask, how did we get into the insanity, the mess in the Ukraine, it's driven as much by the Republicans as by the Democrats, okay? Mitch McConnell was all for it. One or two or three different House speakers, Republicans, have been all for it. The overwhelming majority of the Senate Republican caucus has been gung-ho. Lindsey Graham, I mean, think of these people that we have, these bloodthirsty neocon, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, you could go on and list them. So on something as crucial and as central as not only the Ukrainian context, but the overall foreign policy, the overall welfare state, they're the ones that have pushed the defense budget higher and higher and higher. You can listen to them. They think they need $200 or $300 billion more because there's been some inflation hurting all those poor defense contractors who are not making ends meet. They're bad. Okay, on that issue, there isn't any difference. When it comes to the debt, they blame each other. Okay, the Republicans say it's the big spending Dems. Well, it's not true. Under Trump, spending grew at a 9% real rate per annum. 9%. Obama was 5%. Reagan, my man, was 3%. The average in the post-war period, going all the way back to Eisenhower, is 2.5%. So spending under Donald Trump, 9% per annum in real terms, is off the charts beyond anything any other president oversaw. Who in their right mind would think a Republican, libertarian, small government, Constitution-supporting conservative would have locked down the whole damn economy based on a lot of damn nonsense that came from Dr. Fauci? I mean, well, Donald Trump did it. Now, frankly, I think even if you had a president who was one of the so-called, Republican moderates like a Bush or something, I don't think they would have fallen for it. So Trump did unforgivable things, unforgivable. The lockdowns were unforgivable. The hysteria about the COVID was unforgivable. He signed in 12 months 2 bills, the CARES Act in March 2020, and then another one in December, that threw $4 trillion into the hopper, sight unseen. Nobody knew it was there. Free stuff for everybody, as you can remember. A level of spending that was added on an ad hoc basis that was as big as the entire federal budget at the time. Now, he did this. Okay, now what does this tell me? It tells me his impulses are totally no good. He has no principles. He has no compass. He's likely to do any damn thing, if the circumstances present themselves. So I'm not excited about a Trump administration at all. And I think it's going to be a damn mess. And I think he's going to further undermine the Republican brand, if you want to call it that. The Republicans are supposed to be the party of fiscal rectitude, right? They're supposed to be the ones that know you don't harass the Fed to print even more money than the massive, flood of fiat credit they're already producing. Well, Trump has been as bad as any Democrat on the Fed, on harassing the Fed for easier money, lower interest rates. I mean, he calls himself the low interest man. Okay. So I don't think it's worth 4 years of Trump, because I don't think he'll accomplish anything that's important from the conservative, small government libertarian point of view, which is my point of view.
Let me ask you about the flip side, the case for voting for Kamala Harris as the lesser of two evils. And to do that, I want to just play a recent comment that she made at a press conference where she makes the case about voting against Donald Trump. Could you roll that clip, John?
So yesterday we learned that Donald Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, a retired four-star general, confirmed that while Donald Trump was president, he said he wanted generals like Adolf Hitler had. Donald Trump said that because he does not want a military that is loyal to the United States Constitution. He wants a military that is loyal to him. He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally, one that will obey his orders even when he tells them to break the law or abandon their oath to the Constitution of the United States.
So, in short, Donald Trump has no respect for the rule of law. He's demonstrated it over and over again, most glaringly by doing everything he could to overturn the 2020 election. And so there's a moral duty to vote against someone who threatens the entire liberal order, even if you don't agree with the other person's policies. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's complete and utter nonsense. It's pretty rich for the Democrats complaining about a threat to the constitutional order. They have weaponized the entire Justice Department. They have brought so-called lawfare right into the election process. Said, well, where did all these cases against Trump come from? Well, it wasn't the bright idea of some prosecutor in Manhattan. All of that came right out of the heart of Democrat governance land in Washington. So, it's kind of ironic that when I was a kid and protesting the war in Vietnam, so forth, the Democratic Party was the peace party, okay? And all the hawks and the warmongers were the Republican Party. Here you have Kamala Harris, valorizing someone like Kelly, General Kelly, and all the other damn generals who were in the White House and never should have been there. Kelly's selling books. Kelly, a big Marine career. Well, what has the military leadership of the last 3 or 4 decades accomplished? Nothing but get us into wars that we lost, okay? That we lost people in, that we lost resources in, that we lost world respect from. Did you ever hear Kelly dissenting against the stupidity of the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the bombing of Libya? I could go on and list all the things. He never said a word. So when it comes, all of this was done even without a declaration of war. So talk about, undermining the Constitution. We've been doing that for the last 2 or 3 decades with all these undeclared wars and interventions. And where have all the great generals been on that? They haven't said boo. So I don't believe a word that Kelly has to say. As I said, he's selling a book. There's a huge case against Donald Trump, but it's not because he likes to talk, in exaggerated terms. He's not going to be a dictator. You know why? Because Trump couldn't organize his way out of a paper bag. He proved a wet paper bag. He proved last time he can't lead. He can't stay focused. He goes from one issue to another. He responds to whoever he talks to last. He doesn't have the capacity, if you really want to get down to it, to undermine the constitutional order anyway. And besides that, the Madisonian system is pretty damn strong. And when push comes to shove, the Supreme Court is going to be there. And I think we have a great Supreme Court, and they're not going to tolerate any, nonsense coming from the Oval Office. At the end of the day, there's pretty independent caucuses on the Republican side in the House and the Senate. They're not going to go along with anything that steps over a line. So the problem is Trump's got a big mouth. He's a loud mouth. His rhetoric is reckless and exaggerated and the extreme. So he says a lot of things, and they use that case. But look at January 6th. It was entirely a cooked up Democratic scam. There never was an insurrection. There was a riot because of poor police work at the Capitol building that day. They turned it into, the equivalent of Shays' rebellion, or even the South Carolina attack on Fort Sumter. It wasn't. So it's just more the same.
What about the way that Trump comported himself on January 6th? Does that concern you? I mean, I hear what you're saying, that a combination of the checks and balances, or the checks on his power, plus his own incompetence, are going to make the prospect of him building a military junta pretty far-fetched. But, is it concerning to you all that, every time someone with that attitude, someone who has no respect for the rule of law and our norms, takes a swing at it, it just weakens our system a little bit more?
Well, I think it was unfortunate. He shouldn't have waited all afternoon. He should have, the minute it became clear, I forget the time now, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that they had all been let in. Nobody broke down the barricades at the Capitol. They didn't fight their way through water cannons and, mace, and which they could have used, and they never would have reached the Capitol. But once that happened, he should have given a very firm statement: get the hell out of there, and let the process continue. He didn't do that, but I don't think that was treason. I don't think that was insurrection. I think it was a bunch of yokels and yahoos. It's like the dog who chases a car day in and day out, and one day catches the car and has no idea what to do. That's what happened with this crowd. They didn't expect to be let into the Capitol, and they just poured in because they opened the doors. It's very clear from the cameras that happened. And once they got in the Capitol, they were wandering around saying, oh, gee, what do we do now? There was no organization. They had no guns. They had no plan. They had no communication system. They had no supplies. They had no ammunition, etc. The idea that this was an insurrection is just nonsense, but it tells you how far in the tank the mainstream media is, because they continue to treat this as if it were, as I said, worse than Shays' rebellion. It was nothing of the kind.
Well, David Stockman, I want to thank you for making the case that whoever wins, the uniparty retains control. I want to wrap up by asking you the final question that we ask every guest on our show, in the spirit of the title of the show, which is Just Asking Questions, which is, what is a question that you think more people should be asking?
The question is very obvious, a big one. How in the world can we keep adding $1 trillion to our public debt every 3 months? How are we going to get away with basically enslaving the next generation of Americans with debt, which frankly, by CBO's numbers, is startling. By mid-century, which isn't that far from now, it's 25 years, that's not a long period of time, will be $150 trillion. It isn't going to work. The system is going to come unstuck. It's going to unravel. there would be both economic, political, and social chaos. That's the question. How is this, how does this work? How can it be sustained? And they won't get any good answers, unfortunately, from the uniparty candidates.
Yeah, it's a question that I am continually baffled why more people are not asking. So I appreciate you raising it, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Very good.
Dave Smith, host of the Part of the Problem podcast and once and future Libertarian Party presidential frontrunner. Just kidding. I mean, for a long time, Dave was talked about as the guy that the LP wanted to put on their ticket. He didn't ultimately run for president, but now, despite once calling Donald Trump a war criminal, which I'm pretty sure he calls everybody, he's decided to come out of the closet and, in fact, might be casting a vote for Donald Trump this time around. Dave, is Trump a war criminal, or is he just your war criminal?
Well, I do call a lot of people war criminals, but in my defense, they're all a bunch of war criminals. So I'm not wrong. And yeah, no, I'd still say the absolute same thing I've always been saying about Donald Trump. I am, as I messaged you guys before we did this, I was like, I'm not sure you want me for this, because I might be casting the most unenthusiastic vote in the history of voting. But yeah, I still stand by that. And there's a lot of unforgivable things Donald Trump has done, and being a war criminal is up there at the top.
Explain your rationale, though. Explain your rationale, because I'm right there with you in the same vote. I wrote who I was voting for Reason, and I said, I'm honestly still kind of an undecided voter, and my choices are between Donald Trump because I think that his Supreme Court picks were pretty good the first time around. I'm a person who cares deeply about the abortion issue, and I feel a lot more optimistic about what's going to happen economically under his term. I'm really, really, really worried about price controls under a Kamala Harris presidency and that type of economic illiteracy. But I'm still it's a tough pill to swallow, the election subversion claims. The stolen election claims are just something that I really don't feel comfortable with. So that's how I look at it. But what's going into your reasoning that's making it so that you're interested in voting for this guy?
Well, first of all, for me personally, there's a lot of things that, unforgivable things that Donald Trump's done, and the denying the election or January 6th, they might be like 5,000th on the list. I mean, that's just not even at the, look, we're all libertarians here, and we all know we don't really live in a democracy. And to the extent that you value the illusion of democracy that we have, there was never any real threat that Donald Trump was going to be able to overthrow the will of the people and install himself as a dictator, even if that was what he wanted, which I'm not sure. But no, for me, it's like lockdowns and backing the Saudis in their war against Yemen, his government spending. I mean, there's just like so many, things that he was awful on. I am exclusively voting against Kamala Harris. There's really not much in Donald Trump that I like at all. Look, there are some things. There are which I feel like she has nothing. But with him, there are a few. Okay, he's promised to free Ross. He has said he'll put a libertarian in his cabinet. He does seem, there's at least a chance that he would be a departure and an improvement on Ukraine from where the Biden administration is. Other than that, I don't think there's much. But it is purely a vote against Kamala Harris. I just think she should not be allowed to win. Her campaign is, and I'm a real nerd about this stuff. Like, I'm a political junkie. I could tell you about every single presidential campaign, at least in the last 40, 50 years. And I mean, I could tell you what their platforms were, quote their speeches. I mean, all of them, third parties, Pat Buchanan, Ralph Nader, Ross Perot. I could tell you where all of them were on the issues and tell you what their best speeches were and their best moments were. I've never seen anything like the Kamala Harris campaign. There's not even anything else you could compare it to, where on every level, it doesn't exist. Like, there's nothing. She didn't win a primary. She ran for president 4 years ago and didn't make it to Iowa. She's walked away from every single position that she was running on 4 years ago without explaining why. without even, that was 5 years ago. That's it. Oh, by the way, she's the sitting vice president. Is she running on the current administration's? Like, no. And why not? Because I'm not Joe Biden. Like, it's just nothing there. And to watch her, what really did it for me was this rehabilitate the Cheneys that I just thought was like, what are we doing here? And to me, for everything the Democrats have done over the last really 8 years, starting with framing the sitting president for treason, for these claims that he was a Russian spy, which were totally they produced nothing. Then they were the party of lockdowns and mandates, which, the Republicans were bad on too, but no question they kind of branded themselves. Then they were all in on this disastrous war in Ukraine, which has done nothing except get hundreds of thousands of people killed. And then they're going to essentially coup the president of the United States of America, who they had spent 4 years pretending was not in severe mental decline. And now to run somebody who's just nothing, who's going around campaigning with Liz Cheney, is just enough for me to go, you deserve to lose forever. And I do think, there was a guy who tweeted at me. I can't remember. He writes for some publication, but he tweeted at me yesterday, and he was like, "Oh, Dave can't defend his vote for Donald Trump. It's all about the feels," or something like that, which I actually thought was kind of an interesting comment. And he's not completely wrong. Yeah, that is kind of part of it. I mean, I don't think presidential elections are as consequential as people like to imagine they are. I also have a very different theory on voting in general than most people do. But yes, picking your president is largely symbolic, and that's just the truth. Many Americans may be uncomfortable with that, but I think that is the truth. And I just think the Democrats really deserve to lose this one.
Well, let me ask you about that theory of voting, because as someone who's a self-described political nerd who's watched these campaigns for your entire adult life, you must know that we're always, every cycle, told something like this is the most important election ever. Is that actually true this year? Is 2024 the most important election in your lifetime?
I think it's true every time. I actually think that dumb talking point is almost always true. And it's and I think there's a strong libertarian analysis of that, which is that the size of the government keeps getting bigger. And the bigger the government is, the more consequential it is who wields power within that government. So, I think by definition, if you were talking about the Bill Clinton government, which is pre-Department of Homeland Security and all of this, it's a smaller, less powerful government. And it becomes more important the bigger it gets. So I do think, I do think this is in many ways the most important election. Although, I guess my libertarian criticism of that line of thinking is that elections don't actually have that much power.
Well, could you tell me more about your theory of voting? When should a libertarian vote or not vote?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say I don't think there's really an answer to that question. And it's kind of, it's not I think a lot of libertarians treat voting as if it's theory. It's almost like, if there's a correct answer to whether we should have a minimum wage or not, and you can logically deduce the correct answer from that and kind of have this irrefutable argument. The voting isn't like that. Voting is all, it's all kind of a silly ritual. I live in New Jersey. There's a thing about how much I set Liberty Twitter on fire for the day because which I did pick a pretty clickbaity title for the episode, which is not typically my style, but I was feeling mischievous. But it's I live in New Jersey. None of it matters. It doesn't matter at all who I vote for. And yet people are drawing all these crazy conclusions. I feel for me, and we were talking briefly before we started recording about how we all got little kids. And I think particularly when you have little kids, your time becomes much more valuable than it ever was before. When you don't have kids, you kind of have all the time in the world. When you have little kids, you're like, hey, if you're asking me to do something that's going to take 2 hours, that really better be worth it for me to do. And so, I look at voting for a third party, if a libertarian wants to make the argument that you should be voting for the Libertarian Party, or if you want to make an argument you should, it's a different game. Like, voting for a third party is a different game than voting for one of the major two parties. And I just look at to me, Chase hasn't offered me any reason why I should vote for him. I constantly forget that he's running for president, and I'm me. I mean, my algorithms on YouTube and Twitter should show me something about it, and it's even much more so than the Joe Jorgensen campaign. It's as if it doesn't exist. So that's not enough for me to get out and spend time on that. But I really, really think the Democrats deserve to lose. And so that's kind of what I'm motivated by.
I want to go back to the idea of like January 6th doesn't matter, or the stolen election claims don't matter, because on one hand, I relate to what you are saying. I have the same contrarian streak in me that I think you do and that Zach does, where when I hear so much media hand-wringing over this type thing, like there's the particular like type of person who makes this very hand-wringing sort of hysterical argument about the horrors that Trump carried out around the election. I reflexively want to dismiss that because I don't like the people who are making those claims frequently. However, there is a not insignificant piece of me that looks at what happened on January 6th, which was kind of a psycho mob that got out of hand. We had Ford Fisher on to talk about it because his documentary was absolutely excellent. This was like a few weeks ago, another episode of Just Asking Questions. I thought it was really interesting because, you know, when people hype up January 6th as like, you know, the darkest day for democracy, like I think that's overblown. But it was also interesting, and I think Ford does a great job of presenting just the footage of that day and how, I mean, I find it to be objectionable, feels like putting it too lightly. I find it to be pretty odious that there are people who want to sort of like desecrate Congress in this way. And it's not even clear that they had a particular concept in mind as to what they would do. Like it struck me as unserious on almost every level. And so I think that's a good counter to people's sort of apocalyptic claims. But also at the same time, Trump did, I think, very much sort of desecrate and denigrate our democratic norms when he launched essentially this insane campaign for many months on end where he claimed it was a stolen election and where he filed lawsuit after lawsuit. There were 62 lawsuits total, and pretty much all of them were dismissed or thrown out. I mean, or you know, like the judges ruled against Donald Trump's claims. I think there was one in Pennsylvania out of the 62 where it actually went Trump's way. But even in many cases, Trump appointed judges did not find there to be any merit to this. And I see all of this as just a huge problem where I think it's important that we collectively agree on some facts. I think it's important that we collectively as a society agree that lockdowns were wrong and didn't really have the results that our public health officials claimed they would, that they were a mistake that ought not to be repeated. And I think it's also important that we be able to say, hey, in X, Y, and Z states, there were these small scale instances of voter fraud, perhaps, and it's important to sift through the evidence, but this was not a situation where on a widespread level, there was some kind of awful pulling of the levers that drastically changed the outcomes of the election. Like by and large, election results are pretty good in this country, and we are so lucky to have that because many other places don't. Do you not care about any of this? Like, are you just on some level being a little bit of a contrarian about this, where you don't like the people who freak out about January 6th, and so therefore you're acting like it's not a big deal?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess it's possible that I'm guilty of that. I would say, and I really want to choose my words carefully on this. So, I
think my question to you is, am I wrong to be thinking about it in this way? I very well could be.
I don't know necessarily that you're wrong. I think it comes down to a matter of like where it is in the hierarchy of outrages. I would say that the way I think about it is like this. And again, I just want to let me preface this by saying, do not do anything that's against the law, and do not be violent to anybody. If you're like a fan of mine, that's my advice to you. Don't ever break the law, and treat anyone who's advocating you do like they're a fed. I'm just saying that.
So now you're saying I can't do cocaine this weekend? What the hell, Dave? Jeez.
No, I'm saying I'm not advocating you do.
Okay.
I'm not saying what you can or can't do, but I'm not trying to convince you to. After the year that was 2020, if you think about January 6th is 6 days into 2021. After the year that was 2020, I think that the government deserves a lot worse than what they got. on January 6th. So I'm not somebody who's like, oh my God, the people entered the people's building or so. Like, I don't care about that. I do think, like, and I really mean this, that's the type of radical libertarian I am. Like, if Nancy Pelosi and AOC, like, feared for their lives, I have no problem with that. I'm not advising anyone do anything like that. I'm just saying that's not where my heart goes to. I think of all the American people who were, like, destroyed that year. I think Donald Trump handled the election like a bitch. And he, to your point, I kind of personally, I subscribe to like Glenn Greenwald, the way he said it, I thought was best, where he goes, there's really no evidence that they stole the election from him, but there's overwhelming evidence that they rigged the whole thing against him for 4 years leading up to that. So if you want to say in the spirit of it, but Donald Trump was making very specific claims. His lawyers were making very specific claims. They were unable to substantiate any of them. They just, and to your point, they all got laughed out of court. Like the judges were, and half of them were like Trump appointed judges. And they were like, you have to have something. You can't just come here and say, nah, we don't like it. Can we redo the election, please? And to me, the worst thing that Donald Trump did, the most unforgivable part of all of it, was that he threw his own people under the bus after he sent them there. He turned right around the next day and said they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and then barely mentioned it or lifted a finger about, until it was like re-election time, about even how some of them had been horrifically mistreated and over-prosecuted and essentially, by my definition, tortured, many of them. And so, look, I'd say this. It is very clearly, Donald Trump very clearly did not incite violence. And that's part of the reason why he's not being charged with that, because as libertarians know, there's a very narrow definition of incitement. The Supreme Court has been very clear on that. And thank God, because you lose all freedom of speech if you don't have a very narrow definition of incitement toward violence. However, Donald Trump told, as a leader, as a man, Donald Trump told his people something and then sent them somewhere. And if what he was telling them was true, then they handled it the way they should have. Maybe they should have been more violent. Like, if you're going to say,
I think if it was actually true, then they were total cowards, right?
Right. Yeah, you could make that argument. It shows you the
unseriousness. It shows you what a farce the entire thing was. And we engaged with this very deeply with Ford, which, like, I'm not advocating for the QAnon shaman to take up arms and assassinate Nancy Pelosi or whatever. But, like, if they actually did believe the things that they claimed, and if Donald Trump did, then I'm sorry, this was not violent, revolution. This wasn't an overthrowing of the government and an establishing of a new government. This was child's play. This was LARPing. Yes. This was acting.
In the same, exactly. In the same
pathetic
way,
on every level, and I have a hard time stomaching that.
No, I agree. I mean, but this permeates politics today, right? Like, I mean, I was making this point a bunch when Donald Trump got shot, and you see everybody on MSNBC and the Obamas and the Clintons all wishing him a speedy recovery, and you're like, hey guys, either he's literally Hitler or you're wishing him a speedy recovery. It can't be both. You can't, you know what I'm saying? Like, you gotta, and so similarly to so the indictment of Trump there, not legally, but morally, is that you told your people something and then sent them somewhere where they took what you said. It'd be almost like if I pointed to some guy on the street and I was like, that guy just punched your wife. And you go over and Zach, and you beat the crap out of that guy. And then I went like, oh no, he did. Okay, I guess he did. Now, I didn't technically tell you to beat the crap out of him, but I certainly sent you into a situation where the logical conclusion would be to do that. And then if I turn around and go prosecute Zach to the fullest extent of the law, you're like, what? So in that sense, it wasn't good for the country, and it was a bitch move, and I don't like it, but I mean, Liz, like we're talking about, like, he backed the Saudi war against Yemen. I mean, it was every bit as bad as what Israel's doing to Gaza right now, which, by the way, he will also support and continue to support as president. And like, this is, I mean, they were both, I don't know, I don't really use the word genocide for what's going on in Gaza right now, but there certainly is.
Case Oliver.
Well, there certainly is like a legal argument to it. I don't know exactly, but it's pretty horrific. And I just look, dude, he championed lockdowns. He mocked Sweden for not locking down, and he, was facilitated. I mean, obviously he wasn't a governor, but he declared the state of emergency. He backed up the lockdowns the whole time, and then he, was attacking Thomas Massie, who was trying to hold up the spending. I mean, I'm just saying there are things that just rank so much higher on my list than January 6th that it's not even, that's my point. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason, if I can try to anticipate a little bit of the argument he might make, I think it's about guessing from past behavior what the next 4 years of a Trump administration might look like, because this is a guy who's demonstrated he has very little respect for the rule of law, that he's always talking about his generals. Maybe he didn't have the competence to pull anything off this time, but he'll be more organized this next time. He'll surround himself with loyalists who will actually do things to warp our system even more than it's already been warped. Does that concern you at all? That I think French might say there's like a moral imperative to vote against somebody who's demonstrated they are willing to take things that far, even if they didn't succeed in pulling anything off.
I mean, there's dangers with a Trump administration for sure. I mean, my biggest concerns are war with Iran, and continuing this kind of the insane rhetoric around Israel and the war there through the campaign. I think have just been like horrible. But I don't know. I just have no patience for this talk about Donald Trump not respecting the law or the Constitution, as if this is something unique to Donald Trump. And the words come out of Dick Cheney's mouth. He doesn't respect the Constitution. Like, what? I don't know. I guess maybe it's just because we're kind of in our weird world where we're around a lot of people who really do respect the Constitution, like really actually have read the thing and believe in it and know what it says. And
carry around pocket constitutions.
Yeah.
That's always one of my favorite features of libertarian events. Like, it's so stupid and so perfect all at once.
Well, and look, I've never, there's all these kind of like different camps that are either in the libertarian world or kind of touching the libertarian world. And I've never been that. I've never been like, I'm the constitutionalist guy.
Are you saying you're
like,
cool, Dave? Are you saying you're not like other girls?
No, I want to be very clear. Within the least cool world you could imagine, I'm on the cool side of that world. But at the idea that anybody who really cares about the Constitution pretends that the federal government in any way follows it. I mean, like we haven't declared a war since World War II. That's the constitutionally laid out procedure for fighting a war. We're the most war-hungry country in the world. We haven't declared one since 1942. Like, the whole thing is such a joke. And then, I don't think Donald Trump particularly respects the norms or laws of the land. I don't think Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or George W. Bush do either. So it's a wash.
On the question of war, because I know that's central for you, and you made clear when you said you're probably going to vote for Trump that it was this elevation of the Cheneys that really set you off or was the tipping point. Given all that you've already outlined about the problems with Donald Trump's foreign policy, whether it's in Yemen or you could argue he's more hawkish towards China than the Democrats are. He assassinated an Iranian general. He pulled out of the Iran deal. On the foreign policy dimension, is Trump really superior in any way to Kamala Harris?
Well, certainly on Ukraine. And again, this is still like a bit of a question mark. You never know with any of these politicians whether, they're always worse than what they say they are on the campaign trail. And it's not like Donald Trump doesn't have a great track record. And he was the one who, he was the one who sent the weapons into Ukraine, that even Obama, who backed the coup, wouldn't do. And then Donald Trump, which is, it's funny because the only way people like the normies remember this is because he got impeached over threatening to withhold the arms unless Zelensky looked into the Biden, corruption in Ukraine, which, by the way, was pretty real. But what nobody seemed to remember in that story is that, there was no quid pro quo. There was an attempted quid pro quo. And Donald Trump backed down. He never got the investigations of the Bidens, and he did send the weapons package into Ukraine. And so that clearly in hindsight, at the time, they said it was to deter Vladimir Putin from invading. Certainly that didn't work. So it either we're somewhere in the range of either it didn't deter him or maybe even provoked him a little bit to do the thing. However, I do think that rhetorically, Donald Trump has been light years beyond where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in terms of Ukraine, that the goal should be to bring this thing to an end and work out some type of deal, which, the Biden administration did everything they could to thwart at the beginning of this war. And I think everybody involved would have been way better off if they had just allowed that to happen back in 2022. And so there's a pretty big difference there. I do think there's a general... Trump has a broad instinct to be like, hey, we shouldn't really be fighting all of these stupid wars. Whereas Kamala Harris, in her, I don't know if you saw it the other day with Liz Cheney, where she was a historian, Kamala Harris was explaining World War II.
But in the simplest, kind of stupidest possible terms, right?
I said on my show, and I stand by, I think in the, if she was a third grader, I think you'd say good job. But if she was a sixth grader, you'd be like, you got to come with a little bit more than that. But the whole point of the story was to demonize isolationism, was to say look, the only lesson of history you ever need to understand is that we always got to be fighting wars. And why did World War II happen? Because we were too isolationist before World War II. And then and then she invokes Cheney and John McCain as she's sitting next to Liz Cheney. And so there is, there's a signal difference there. But yeah, I'm not really arguing. Donald Trump was terrible on Israel, terrible on Palestine, terrible on Iran, a bit better on Syria than the Obama administration, maybe a little bit better on Iraq. But yeah, he's still bad on a lot of stuff.
What do you say to the libertarians, of which there are apparently many, who seem to think it appropriate to vote for Kamala Harris as the liberty-protecting presidential candidate? What viscerally goes through your body and mind when you encounter these folks in the wild?
I don't ever encounter them in the wild, only on the internet, which I guess is the wild. But I probably feel about them the same way that they feel about me. I think they're deeply unserious people, and I think that the only way I think you can reach that conclusion is by swallowing a lot of state propaganda and not realizing how much of it is complete bullshit. I think that probably the best argument that I could think of supporting Kamala Harris would be that at least half the country will never believe in elections again or something like that. But I think there's, again, like I said before with Kamala Harris, she is nothing. She doesn't stand for anything. There's no policy or no issue. There's no thing that you're and again, like I said, I'm a nerd for this stuff. Even Hillary Clinton, who had a lot of the same flaws as a politician that Kamala Harris has, the weird cackling when nothing funny has been said, and the kind of lack of charisma and all. But Hillary Clinton had stuff to say. Now, I think she was wrong about almost all of it. But if you asked Hillary Clinton about foreign policy, she had convictions. It was we need to have a no-fly zone in Syria right now. She was running on something. It was a disaster. But Kamala Harris doesn't even have any of that. There's not any one issue. And so she's just...
That gets to the heart of one of the things that I am really concerned about, I'm troubled by with Kamala Harris, which is we are in an especially hot foreign policy time right now. And we might be on the very precipice of electing somebody for president who has, as far as I can tell, approximately zero experience in that realm. And then who did she choose for her vice president? Somebody that she could lean on when making these decisions? Oh, none other than governor of fucking Minnesota. Like, what? It's just so impossible for me to imagine Harris and Walz making any sort of cogent, reasonable foreign policy decisions. When I think about the types of names that you've seen circulating in press accounts of possible administration staffers, I mean, we're talking, Democrat war hawks, sort of the likes of which we've seen for many decades prior. It's just not clear to me that this, like, we would have either bumbling incompetence or we would have basically these empty suits of politicians purportedly running the show, but then staffing cabinets with people who are honestly, very interested in continuing war and or escalating situations abroad. Like, to me, it just seems quite obviously like we're shooting ourselves. Like, I'm just shocked that we've gotten to this point at this time. Maybe it would make sense if we were in a different time, but right now, I mean, make it make sense. Like, that's the part that I kind of don't understand. I think there's a pretty good argument to be made for, like, you have to prioritize the foreign policy experience and platform of a candidate for president pretty highly, because that is an area, that's a realm where, I'm sorry, they have a lot of war-making powers, and we as libertarians know that, I think, and care about that more than anybody else. We want to roll that back, but the fact of the matter is that's just reality. Like, that's what we're faced with right now. And so we're thinking about putting Kamala Harris in charge of that?
Yeah. No, I mean, and look, it's in the first Cold War, we averted nuclear war only because we had a commander-in-chief who was willing to get on the phone and actually, you know what I mean, like, rise to the occasion a couple times. And like, it's pretty much agreed on by historians that, like, we were very close to launching nuclear weapons. Like, it was going to happen if not for these serious people who actually took that threat seriously. And I mean, currently, right now, with Joe Biden as whatever pretend president or something like that, I do find this to be a very dangerous situation. It's still a dangerous situation with Trump. But I also, weirdly, which I couldn't imagine, but I do think in some way, Kamala Harris kind of represents like this further decline into anti-intellectualism, like even more so than Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump, while he's kind of speaks like a third grader and has clearly never once read a book and doesn't really know what he's talking about deeply on any issue, there is something. He's been a boss. He's run a big company. He's been run a TV show and written a book, and I just see absolutely nothing impressive out of Kamala Harris at all in her entire track record. I mean, it's just abysmal. And my takeaway from it is just essentially that it's going to be the machine running the show, much like it is with Joe Biden right now. And that, to me, is probably the most dangerous outcome.
Last question I wanted to ask you, just because you were so involved in the Libertarian Party this year and then sort of declaimed any involvement whatsoever. And as you noted, they're going to be a pretty marginal force this year. What would you like to see happen there? What would a course correction for the Libertarian Party look like?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the aftermath of the Chase campaign. What I'd always kind of like to see out of the Libertarian Party is just something. Right? The bar is so low. It's like, let's just see something. Like, and one of the things that I've been really kind of blown away by, and not as if I was somebody who had like high expectations for what a Chase Oliver campaign would be, but it's like, can you point to anything? Like, what is it that's going to come out of this presidential election? Or, I mean, when I was pretty critical of Jo Jorgensen, I thought she was a very bad candidate. But like, if you were to look at the 2020 campaign, I would say like the thing that came out of that was Spike Cohen. And that Spike Cohen was a guy who, like, most people didn't know before then. And now he's somebody who, like, libertarians all know. And he's got a big platform now. And he's one of our best messengers. I mean, every time I see Spike on, like, a interview or a debate or anything like that, he's always nailing it. He just does a really good job making the libertarian case. So, okay, that's something. Something came out of that presidential campaign. I don't see anything. out of Chase. I mean, I don't see like, the people who like him swear that he's a really great messenger. And I just look at it and I'm like, okay, but where's the evidence of that? Like, if he was such a good messenger, wouldn't there be something? I mean, wouldn't there have been like a bunch of new members to the party, or you would see him, have gained, hundreds of thousands of followers? Or I mean, I know people say, oh, Twitter's not real life. Like, okay, forget Twitter, anything in real life. I just see nothing. And so, if the Libertarian Party is to justify its own existence, I think you should have an answer. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there should be like, oh, here, this is what we can point to that we're doing and working on. So I always root for the Libertarian Party. I'd like the future to be better. I don't know exactly what direction that is. And I will say I've become more and more skeptical of the prospect that the liberty movement can ever really be a movement. I think that a lot of us, myself included, I'm definitely guilty of this. For many years, we're kind of trying to recreate the Ron Paul thing. Like, it's like, oh, let's get back to that. Let's get back to like 2008, 2012, when there was this big, I think that where the country is right now, the left-right divide, even amongst libertarians, is just almost like, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Can you see a world where like you guys and the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire are all in one movement together? Can you see a world where some of the people at Reason and me are in a movement together? It's like there's so much disdain on both sides that it's like maybe we're just not all in the same thing here. And I don't know. The whole idea of the Libertarian Party is like that you could bring these kind of left libertarians and right libertarians together into one coalition, particularly around the issue of like immigration. I'm not so sure that that's doable anymore.
Yeah, I would hazard.
In Kansas really did a number on you. The nihilism is really coming through. Are you good?
Well, no, I'm an optimist. I'm just not sure I'm optimistic about that.
I would hazard to guess that if there's one issue that is going to force these different camps together, it's going to be a fiscal crisis. And I don't want to see it happen, but that's what happened in a place like Argentina that allowed a figure like Milei to rise. When things get bad enough, people will put aside the more ancillary issues to deal with something like that. And again, I don't want to see that happen, but that is the kind of world where I could see you just need to like reach out to other people who understand basic economics and like form an alliance with them.
I agree with you. There's also something so profoundly disappointing about the Chase Oliver bid for president, Dave, that I think you're appropriately tapping into. One thing that's always on my mind is like, if only like, the most popular podcast in the entire country had somebody who was pretty libertarian adjacent and libertarian sympathetic and knew what the word libertarian meant. Oh, wait, we do. It's called fucking Joe Rogan, right? Like, I'm sorry, but like I think my media strategy for getting my name out there would just be so different than whatever the hell the LP and Chase Oliver are doing, right? Like, surely there's a means. I mean, Joe Rogan's having Trump on his show this weekend. I know JD Vance was just on Tim Dillon's show. Like, the opportunities are out there. And for whatever reason, the Chase Oliver crowd can't really figure it out. And I'm a little bit like, okay, so who exactly are we proselytizing? Who exactly are we winning over? Who are we appealing to? It's just not clear to me that this matters at all. And so like, why should I go out to a polling place to cast a vote for somebody like that? Like,
yeah, I could not agree more. And, I gotta say, and I don't, I'm trying to guard against like being self-centered here or something like that. But it's kind of like, yeah, hi, I'm the guy you'd probably want to talk to. And like, I was the first one who walked over and congratulated Chase when he won the nominee, and I invited him on my show, and I've publicly invited him on a couple of times since then. No one from the campaign has reached out. No one has tried, which is like, hey, look, fine. If you want to say that, like, if that's not your strategy, you got some other strategy, and you don't think that's the best use of your time or resources, fine. Then I don't really think your supporters can turn around and complain when we're not supporting you. Like, you didn't even make an attempt. But also, I would just think, like, Yeah, I mean, I'm 1 degree away from, I'm like close friends with all of the people with the biggest shows. Like, wouldn't you think you'd at least attempt that? Or like, fine, you're not going to attempt to come on my show and then maybe see if I could facilitate you getting on Tucker or Rogan or any of these other huge shows. But so then like, what is your strategy? What is it? And it seems to me from what I can see, it's like I even literally before we did this earlier today, I went on his Twitter because I just haven't seen anything from him. I'm like, what is he even doing? And it's just like, it seems like their strategy is to tweet the blandest things. And like they're not even like, even be a radical left libertarian. Fine, dude. Like, talk about, I don't know, do something, stir up some controversy, get your name out there in some way. And I got to say, and I don't, you know, I don't want to be mean to Chase because like I know he's a real person and I've met him several times. I have nothing against him. It's just like when it comes to this politics,
kind and polite, yeah.
Yeah, but like when it comes to politics, you kind of just have to be honest about this stuff. And I just first I find him to be a very unimpressive candidate. And he does a thing where he does like a very good impression of a politician. Like that's kind of his thing. It's like, I'm going to look like a politician. I'm going to sound like a politician. And for the most part, he's got his libertarian talking points down. And for the most part, aside from like 4 or 5 issues, if you ask him a question, he'd probably give an answer that all 3 of us would agree on. If you asked him about taxes or money or regulation or drugs or whatever. But I've never once ever out of him seen like, a deep and thoughtful answer. Where I was like, wow, I've actually kind of learned something from Chase, or I've never really thought about it that way. Like, wow, he really made me think, or clearly this guy has really done deep thinking and deep reading on that. There's just nothing like that. And so it's like, I think there's an insecurity on their campaign that there would be anything that he could do that good if he were to go on these shows. And, you know, I do think that he's kind of like, he's walked away a bit from like what he used to be over the last few years, like really the woke libertarian thing. Like he's not trying to talk about like transitioning kids or something like that. Like I know you brought it up, Liz, when you were interviewing him, but
sorry.
He wasn't trying to bring it up. I was
on my worst behavior. I'm sorry, Dave.
Well, I mean, I thought it was such a bad moment for him where he was kind of reduced to arguing that you can't get a tattoo until you're 18. So somehow getting a tattoo is a more important life decision for like a 15-year-old to make than being chemically castrated. I was like, that seemed nutty to me. But I do think, so, okay, I'll just tell you a very quick story, okay? And this to me has always been what summed up Chase Oliver in my mind, which is maybe unfair, but I've only met him like a few times. And so at Reno in 2022, at the takeover, what's been dubbed the Reno reset, I remember we sat down and he was like 3 rows behind me. And when we all started doing the voting, like I was a delegate that year too, and the first vote came up and the Mises Caucus had like signs. It was like vote yes or vote no. And they'd put them up so that we were all voting in unison. And I remember he screamed out, like he's like 3 rows behind me, and he screams out, he goes, following orders, very libertarian of you. And I remember I turned around and I was like, what do you think a libertarian is? And like, there's just, as silly as that moment is, I do feel like there's this strain of people who call themselves libertarians, like the woke libertarians, who basically think libertarianism is like being mad at your dad. Like that's essentially what it is. It's like, nuh-uh, I don't got to follow your rules, you know? And it's just like, that's not what it is to me. And there's nothing about that makes me want to support you.
Dave, let me ask you the final question of the show that we ask all our guests, which is, what is a question you think more people should be asking?
Well, there's a lot of those. I think the biggest question that most people should be asking, and particularly libertarians, is what is the future of the Trump movement post-Trump? Because one way or the other, he's either about to lose and he's done, at least done being the presidential candidate, or if he wins, he's there for 4 more years and then he's done. And now you've got like half of the voting population who is, I think, more profoundly anti-statist, or at least anti this regime than has ever existed in my lifetime before. I mean, you've got, one of the major political parties, almost all of their voters don't believe the media, don't believe in elections, or don't believe that elections are real, don't believe the FBI or the CIA, don't trust cops particularly, don't trust military adventurism. And I think if you're a libertarian, you look at that and you go like, oh, that's kind of where the action is. Like this is going to determine, this is going to have a huge role in what America looks like for the rest of this century. And I think that's kind of the question. Like, where does that movement go?
Dave, thanks for coming on the show.
Anytime, guys. Thank you.
Today we're joined by Jacob Grier. He is an author, a bartender, a longtime contributor to Reason magazine, and he recently wrote a piece in Liberal Currents advocating for why libertarians ought to vote for Kamala Harris if they can stomach it. Thank you so much for joining us, Jacob Grier.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Jacob, we've been asking everyone whether or not this is actually the most important election of our lifetimes. What do you think?
I would say close tie between this or 2020. The obvious common ingredient there being Donald Trump. I mean, you could even make the case for 2016, although I will cop to my own mistake not taking him seriously enough back in that election. But I think, ever since then, either 2020 or now would certainly qualify.
Reason has sort of long had, I don't want to call it an editorial stance per se, but a shared disposition among almost everybody who serves on our staff, that the idea that this is the most important election of our lifetimes, whenever that crops up, because you hear that repeated over and over again every 4 years, that this is just kind of a silly thing that people believe, and that, it's important to not think this time is different. Okay, but why is this time different in your estimation exactly? Like break it down for us in greater detail. Why is it that Donald Trump this time around is would you consider him an existential threat?
I would. I would go so far as to say that, he's certainly a right-wing authoritarian and, in the words of his own military advisors and his own chief of staff, a fascist. And I think that's a pretty accurate description for reasons we could get into. But I will say I largely agree in the past with the approach of a lot of libertarians and of Reason magazine historically. I'll say that, prior to 2020, I voted libertarian in every presidential election of my lifetime. And I thought the stakes changed pretty substantially with the election of Donald Trump. And the main reason for that is that it no longer makes sense, I think, to tally up candidates based on, their different stances on a variety of issues. I think that made sense if you had someone like Obama and McCain or Obama and Mitt Romney, where you can kind of look at both sides and say, well, I like some of his policies, but I hate him on this, and I like the other guy's policy, but I don't like him on that. And you maybe come up with a slight preference for one or the other, or you say screw it and you vote libertarian. I think that's a valid approach. I think that's definitely not valid now with Donald Trump because he presents an actual threat to our elections. And that became very clear leading up to 2020, and then he acted on it in the 2020 election. This is someone who does not believe that the law applies to him and who does not believe that voters have the right to reject him. And we saw that play out with multiple fronts of trying to overturn the 2020 election. He's on tape talking to Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, trying to intimidate him to find enough votes to overturn the election. They sent fake slates of electors to Congress. They tried to pressure Mike Pence to use dubious authority to overturn the results. They sicked a violent mob on the Capitol. January 6th of 2021, really one of the most disgusting days in modern American history that I can recall ever seeing. So when you add all up together, I think that overwhelms any normal policy differences that you might look at between the candidates.
I feel like if we're going to use the F word, it's important for you to substantiate it a little bit. You talked about how Donald Trump has been called a fascist by his own military generals. Also, I mean, these military generals in some cases acted sort of unilaterally, attempting to sort of thwart some of Donald Trump's plans. How do you substantiate, him being a fascist? I mean, he doesn't seem, at least from where I'm sitting, like he actually accomplished anything close to what many of the Trump doomers claimed he would do to America. So explain to me what you're thinking there.
Well, I don't think he necessarily has the power to rule as a fascist, but he certainly has the aspirations to do so. And it's not just generals. It was also it was his chief of staff Kelly who says the same thing, who was not acting in a military role at that time. And there's different elements of that. I think one, obviously, that you tend to associate with fascism is an emphasis on nativism and stoking racial resentment, which has been part of Donald Trump's political career from day one, when he rose up with his birtherism about Barack Obama being ineligible to be president, and it continues right up to the present day with Trump, talking about Haitians eating people's dogs and cats, and all the other ways he demonizes immigrants. So his entire campaign is focused on, putting America first, by which he mostly means, white Americans who are already here, and demonizing everyone else. You look at his approach to power. A lot of people say he's a free speech candidate, but he's pretty much on record, talking about how he wants to revoke the licenses of TV stations that criticize him. He intimidates people who want to speak out. I think you can make a fair look at the Washington Post non-endorsement this week in that light. And then if you look, obviously January 6th, trying to overturn the election. And now, thanks to Donald Trump, we have the new Supreme Court ruling saying that presidents can basically not even be prosecuted for crimes they commit in office, except on very narrow grounds. So I think on all those fronts, he would fit the definition of someone who wants to be a fascist, whether he can pull it off or not.
That's the big question for some people who are just not willing to vote for Kamala Harris. At the beginning of this episode, the first person we talked to was David Stockman, and he basically said most of the concerns about Trump's authoritarianism are overblown, and that there are too many obstacles to his success should he want to try to pursue that. And the events of 2020 were kind of evidence of that he's just not really competent enough to be a dictator, and therefore it's not a concern that libertarians should take that seriously.
I mean, I think that you could take some comfort in the fact that Donald Trump is just not a smart person, and also lacks impulse control, and so is unlikely to be as an effective authoritarian ruler as someone who didn't have those qualities would be. But I think you should also be really concerned about who's no longer going to be in his second administration if it comes to that, if he does win another election. And, in this first term, he was restrained by what they like to call the adults in the room, and I think a lot of those people are no longer going to be working for him or willing to associate with this administration. I think he has a lot more experience now knowing on how to staff the government. And really, even looking at 2020, you can say that, yeah, we got the correct result in the end, but that really hung by a narrow thread. It depended on people like Brad Raffensperger, like even Mike Pence, who in the end had the integrity to not go along with these plots to overthrow the election. And if you look at who is with Donald Trump now, people like J.D. Vance, who Slate at Reason has written about at great length, these are not people that I would trust in a situation like that to have the integrity to do the right thing and protect our system of limited government.
You mentioned earlier presidential candidates of yore involving, including John McCain and Barack Obama. And one thing that I'm curious about is, looked at from sort of an anti-war libertarian perspective, I think many of those types, including Dave Smith, who we had on the show earlier, would take issue with the fact that, Obama's drone strikes are so normalized in American political discourse, right? Like, that's not seen as disqualifying. Or John McCain, warmonger supreme, or the degree to which Kamala Harris is leaning on Liz and Dick Cheney for advice and campaigning. And it's kind of wild to me that that type of thing is so accepted, and yet Trump, I mean, he certainly has some odd and slightly concerning bluster about Putin, for example, and Xi Jinping, and he's praised different dictators and strongmen in the past. But Trump, I think, if you actually look at what he's done foreign policy-wise, there's actually a fair bit for libertarians to like, or at least be intrigued by. What do you make of, are you just letting the Obamas and McCains and Cheneys of the world off the hook when it comes to war? Or does this complicate your view of Donald Trump? Do you, as a libertarian or sort of somebody who understands and I think is appreciative of sort of libertarian anti-war stances, is that a reason to support Trump and perhaps look less fondly on, other presidential candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with you. The drone strikes under Obama drove me absolutely crazy during the Obama years, especially the way people on the left and Democrats and other liberals were willing to give him a pass on that. And I think that is one of the biggest blemishes on his record as a president by far. And I wish we had a stronger anti-war movement in the U.S. There's a lot of areas of libertarian policy where I just wish libertarian ideas had a stronger hold. Unfortunately, in this election and in lots of elections, I just don't think that good anti-war policy is something that we're going to get a perfect record on or anything close to it.
But isn't Trump our best hope of that?
So that's where I disagree. I think obviously in his first term he didn't pull us out of Afghanistan. By the way, that was Biden.
That was Biden.
He lifted a lot of the
credit where due, right? Like that was in my view, one of the decent, I guess, highlights. I mean, it was pretty poorly executed, but that was sort of a highlight of, the Biden administration, the Biden years, right?
Yeah, and to go back to drone strikes, Trump removed a lot of the guardrails that were in place. As flimsy as those guardrails were over the Obama administration, they were weakened even further under Trump. But on foreign policy, I think it really just comes down more than anything to temperament. And there weren't really a lot of cases where Trump's foreign policy chops would have been tested, I think, in his first term. So we don't really know how he would react in a more unstable environment like what we're in right now. I think he gets a lot of benefit from just not having been in a chaotic environment in his first term, other than the chaotic environment that he put into his own White House. And going forward, and you just look at Donald Trump, is this the temperament of someone that you trust to have the most powerful army in the world, to have access to nuclear weapons, to be making calls of war and peace, to be able to do drone strikes on anyone? I mean, this is someone who doesn't have the self-control to not rape someone in a Bergdorf Goodman dressing room, and we want to put him in charge of the military. This seems like a very bad call to me, and I think libertarians who see him as having anti-war cred are giving him way too much benefit of the doubt.
Jacob, it's interesting when you were laying out your voting record there, saying you voted for a libertarian your entire adult life until 2016. I'm in the same boat as you. I voted for libertarians that entire time, voted for Biden in 2020, although I now have some major regrets about that vote. And that's partially why I have opted, at least so far, not to vote this election, because I share a lot of your concerns about Donald Trump. But I also have a lot of concerns about a Kamala Harris agenda that makes it hard for me to cast a vote for her, because I am just worried about her economic policies and what they could do to this country. In your Liberal Currents article, you did make a little bit of an affirmative case for why you think a Harris agenda wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world from a libertarian perspective. Could you lay that out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, libertarians, I think, very rightly kind of jumped on her comments on having a federal anti-price gouging bill.
Yeah.
Which it was never really clear exactly what she meant by that, because there were different versions of those ideas going around. I don't know if any of them were really good, but some were more harmful than others. But I think an important thing to note there is that in order to do that, she would need the support of Congress. So this is not something she could unilaterally do as president. And
I thought she was talking about using the Federal Trade Commission to implement some of these, and using her lawyerly experience to, go after companies who quote unquote price gouge in the same way that she did in California.
Well, I think that might be the case with like the FTC and like antitrust. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, I mean, I'm not probably a fan of all that. Like, I do have worries about that. But I think a point that's been made that, especially Josh Barrow, the economics writer who I follow in this, is that, there are things Kamala Harris might do on economics that violate Econ 101, but so does Donald Trump, tariffs being the hugest one. And this is a guy who's literally said tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Nobody really knows exactly what policy he's going to pursue, because he's not someone who gets hung up on policy details, but he's talking about a 10% across the board tariff on imported goods, even more from other countries, possibly triggering, an international trade war, leaving Americans much less free to trade with partners abroad. And that's something that as president, he has way more discretion over. And similarly with immigration, with immigration enforcement, that falls under the executive branch. He has a lot of leeway there. So I worry about Kamala Harris. I think her worst impulses that might happen on economics will be constrained. And there's also some things that I like about her, which is that along with other Democrats, she's coming around to a YIMBY view on housing. And there's a limit to what federal government can do on housing. It's largely a local thing. But there is interest on the Democratic side in this, what's become to be known as the abundance agenda of like cutting red tape and making it so that we can build more. And Tim Walz has been interested in that. Kamala Harris has been interested in that. And I see a role for libertarians as opposed to, instinctually always opposing Democrats, actually coming around to maybe encourage that side of the Democratic Party more than the tax and spend and regulate side,
or influence them away towards the better ideas and away from, because the housing agenda is also a mixed bag.
It's subsidizing demand.
Yeah,
right?
there's an aspect of subsidizing demand.
It's a terrible idea.
There's an aspect of cracking down on so-called greedy landlords, but then there is also the cutting red tape or trying to incentivize localities. So it's a mixed bag, and I guess your point here is that maybe libertarians would do well to try to jump in there and, push them towards the good and away from the bad.
Yeah, bring her more to the Jared Polis side.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about, it seems like for you, Donald Trump's views on immigration are a real non-starter. And I relate to that. I've mulled voting for Trump, but frankly, I believe not in open borders as some sort of like angry detractors claim all the reason libertarians believe, but that we need to drastically increase immigration quotas and let a whole bunch of people into this country. But at the same time, when I look at what's happening at the southern border and the way the asylum seeking process is going and the degree to which it's just complete and utter chaos and lawlessness, that's very concerning to me. One thing that I'm noticing is both candidates seem very law and ordery this time around, right? It's not as if Harris is especially dovish on immigration. Do you actually feel like Harris being in the White House would create the type of immigration policy that you favor?
No, I don't think anyone with a reasonable chance of being elected would implement the type of immigration.
But would it resemble it in any way, really? When I look at Harris's plan, I think I would feel differently about her if I looked at her immigration policy proposals and saw something that seemed workable and likely to happen, and also something that would drastically up the number of high-skilled and low-skilled workers entering this country while also cracking down on the complete chaos going on. What do you see when you read her policy proposals there?
I honestly don't know. I would obviously like anything that tends towards more liberalism and more openness, and I think it's really hard to tell what her own views are while she's constrained by, one, being part of the Biden administration as vice president, and also, two, running an election where it's going to be very close, and it seems like immigration is one of the key issues. And so I can certainly understand why she feels the need to reach out in the way that she is, even if I don't disagree with it. And so I just kind of have to hope that she won't. But I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about Donald Trump, who is running on a promise to deport 15 to 20 million people from the United States, which is more than even most estimates of the number of people here undocumented, which would be at 11 million. So there's no way to do that legally, and there's no way to do that humanely. I don't think, conservatives and libertarians don't think that government is efficient generally. They don't generally think that law enforcement is going to always act fairly and within the law. And yet they're electing someone, or they may be electing someone, who wants to use the full force of the state against 5% of the American population to forcibly remove them from our borders. There's no way that's going to work out well. There's no way the letter of the law is going to be followed. This is going to be done fairly and humanely. So I just don't think they're even remotely comparable.
What do you think should happen to the people who have crossed into our country and who, in many cases, have not been vetted and who are here awaiting court dates, and who in some cases are also using, welfare funded by taxpayers in places like New York City, like me? Like, what exactly should happen to those people?
For the most part, I think people who come to the United States, whether documented or not, are here because they're looking for better lives, and they're generally, contributing economically. Even if they don't contribute economically in the short term, you could say the same thing about babies. Babies aren't contributing to the economy. They're taking up resources in terms of healthcare and schools.
I say that to my son all the time.
Yeah, right.
Always chastising him for that.
Yeah, babies they need to pull their weight more. But no, we don't use that as an argument for why we need to stop people having babies. we just accept that as part of the bargain. And in the long run, most of those babies grow up and become productive parts of society, economically, culturally, et cetera. And it's the same thing with immigration. So I'm not a detailed policy wonk when it comes to immigration. I know that the pathways to becoming legal in the United States are incredibly convoluted and complex. I don't know exactly how to fix that, but I would say that people who are here peacefully, we should, to the greatest extent possible, figure out how to keep them here legally.
On one hand, I'm persuaded by that idea of offering amnesty to people who have crossed into this country illegally, because I believe in many of the same things that many of the same benefits that you're outlining there. But the thing I struggle with is, like, if we're going to talk about upholding norms and rule of law, especially in the context of the Trump administration, boy, does it sure seem like we're ignoring rule of law and this sense of, like, our laws ought to be upheld if we create this incentive to come here. Because if you know that you can cross into this country illegally and then be offered amnesty and or in some cases welfare to get a start in this country, people have a mighty large incentive to keep doing that. And I struggle a little bit with, like, well, I kind of understand why people feel a sense of, like, if we are going to have laws, we ought to enforce them. I do think that the problem is the amount of state force that would be required to enforce them is something that I would have a hard time stomaching, and I think a lot of people would. But how do you deal with that tension of, like, aren't these, asylum seekers who have entered into this country illegally, if offered amnesty, doesn't that totally violate rule of law?
Yes, I would turn the rule of law question back on libertarians who bring it up and say, what about weed? What about drug laws? Is everyone who's smoked weed violating the rule of law? And so we should keep them in prison if they've been convicted. We should not expunge their records. I think most libertarians would say, like, no, this was just a bad law, and these people weren't victimizing anyone. And so we should not go on punishing them. We should let them back into society. And I think immigration is pretty much on the same level. Like, I don't see someone, crossing the border illegally as victimizing anyone. It's an administrative violation more than anything. So no, I would say that we can find ways to do amnesty and not destroy the rule of law. I mean, Ronald Reagan did it in the 1980s, and I don't think anyone's saying that Ronald Reagan's path to amnesty for immigrants have undercut the rule of law.
I have another question about the rule of law, because you raised a lot of important points about Trump's threat to the rule of law. When I think about the potential threats to the rule of law for a Kamala Harris presidency, one that always springs to mind for me is the role of the Supreme Court. She's put, quote unquote, reforming the Supreme Court at the top of her agenda, by which she seems to mean setting term limits. That's, a debatable proposition. But then in the past, the Democrats' agenda has definitely been to pack the Supreme Court. They're very discontented with the Supreme Court. As a libertarian, I view the Supreme Court as possibly the only branch of the federal government that is actually restraining their infringement on our liberties whatsoever. So I don't want to see any of that happen. And I'm worried that that's one potential threat to the rule of law that will come from the Democrats. What do you think?
I mean, I would be worried about that. I don't think it's super probable. I think if we're going to reform the Supreme Court, which I think there are good ideas for how to do that, I don't think it's going to be a court packing situation. I think it would be more likely something that would be accomplished, through more legal means and more structured means to preserve legitimacy.
Let me, and what about another worrisome aspect of the modern Democratic Party is our threats to free speech. We saw during the COVID pandemic, and during the 2020 election, that there was this backdoor pressure on social media companies. The Supreme Court unfortunately ruled that it was constitutional, and they seem to have an appetite for exerting that kind of pressure. The Trump campaign goes so far as to argue that this cost them the election because of the suppression of the Hunter Biden story. And that's way more consequential than anything Donald Trump did in the lead up to the election. How worried, does that give you pause at all, the potential free speech threats of a Harris administration?
I think it's overblown. I think the free speech on platforms is definitely something I think about a lot. And the Hunter Biden story was ultimately a mistake made by what was then Twitter, as I think just about everybody involved with that has now acknowledged. Although I'm very skeptical of the idea that it actually hurt Donald Trump, because I think there was a bit of a Streisand effect there, where by suppressing the story, they actually made it much, much bigger. So I'm very skeptical of that argument. And I'm just not persuaded that communication between government and social media companies, it can blur the line between coercion, but I think a lot of people are overly concerned with how that works. I mean, if you're running a social media company and you're responsible for hundreds of millions of people viewing content, and you're aware that there are potential fraudulent activities going on to undermine an election, whether done by a campaign or whether done by Russia or someone else, you want the FBI to be able to tell you about that. So I don't think it's necessarily nefarious to have this contact between government and social media companies who are trying to be responsible stewards of their media environment. There's a lot of criticism you could make of the platforms, and on that front, I would criticize old Twitter, I would criticize Elon Musk, I would criticize Facebook. There are lots of problems there. I'm really excited about open platforms like Blue Sky that are coming out, but I don't see it so much as a governmental threat. And again, I would look at Donald Trump, who's the only candidate explicitly talking about taking vengeance on his enemies by revoking licenses for TV stations.
Right.
So again, there are problems on the left, but I think Donald Trump is far more explicit and likely to try to act on them.
Let me ask you about one more thing before we let you go, which is, as someone who's voted for the Libertarian Party in the past, what are your thoughts about the current state of the Libertarian Party, and why isn't Chase Oliver getting your vote?
Yeah, I mean, I think the party as a whole is a disaster. I think, Liz, you wrote a great article on the current state of the Libertarian Party, which leaves a lot to be desired. I'll say Chase is a pleasant surprise. I don't agree with him on everything, but I appreciate what he's doing. I think he's a far better candidate than
What is he doing, though?
Well, the positions he takes. I appreciate his
do you
position.
feel like he's being successful in proselytizing for libertarianism?
I don't know how he could be, given how much the party hates him.
Fair enough. But I mean, if I were running for president as a libertarian, I would try to get on a ton of podcasts. I would try to, get features written about me in all of the major publications. As far as I can tell, I mean, maybe he's just striking out left and right, but I'm not really seeing his name anywhere surprising or exciting. Are you?
No, not really. And again, like you, I don't know if that's, his fault or if that's the media environment.
And also the fact that his own party does not back him and has likely made very little effort to do that. That's part of the context of Chase Oliver.
It's also tough when all the New York Magazine reporters are, fancying RFK Jr. versus RFK Jr. was sort of the fun, independent, scrappy upstart. Yeah. And Chase Oliver has very much, stayed out of the limelight.
Yeah. I mean, I will say 10 years ago, if Chase Oliver was the candidate in 2016 or 2012, whatever you want to go back to, I would have voted for him happily. I think he's a good guy. I think with the threat posed by Donald Trump, the right message to send is that no matter who you are, you got to put aside your differences, whether you're progressive, whether you're liberal, whether you're libertarian, whether you're a neocon or a conservative. Liz Cheney doesn't agree with Kamala Harris on a lot of things. I admire Liz Cheney for putting those differences aside to say, look, this is who's going to fight the fascist and obey and keep up the rule of law and democracy. And so just this once, I've got to vote Democratic. And that's my view as well. I can't expect Chase to say the same thing, I guess, since he is running as a candidate. But I think that's the right approach in this election, is just to say that, this threat is real. It's unlike any normal presidential candidate that we've seen in modern history. And the right thing for us to do is to vote for the opposition.
Well, let me ask you the last question of the show, which we ask to every guest. What is the question that you think more people should be asking?
Ooh. About this election or?
About anything that comes to mind.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. Wow. So many questions I want to think about there. I wish I'd prepared for that. I would, here's my, let's see. I think I'm personally curious about, what the Harris administration will do on tobacco policy. If anybody's read me in Reason, that's something I write about all the time. She's been very quiet about it. And I'll even say, in the interest of putting their differences aside, tobacco policy is one issue where I actually think the outcome would probably be better under Trump than under Harris. I'm undercutting
it would be subsidized in pouches for all of the good people of America, right?
I guess my dark question would be what on earth would happen if RFK was in charge of the FDA? We're going to be talking about why, vapes need to be banned, but all natural cigarettes are healthy for you. I don't know. But yeah, I guess just on a personal note, I want to know what tobacco policy and vaping policy is going to be in the next administration, whoever that is.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us, Jacob. And we've presented a full spectrum of views on this episode. As many of our viewers will know, Reason is one of, if not the only publication where all the contributors actually publicly say who they're voting for. So we'll drop
which is great.
Yeah, it's great. It generates a lot of controversy, but I think it's a really healthy practice, both for an act of transparency and also just for me as a journalist, as someone who's publicly commenting on it. I think stopping to think deeply about who you're voting for or not voting for and why. I find it to be a useful exercise, and hopefully this episode has helped people, think through it a bit more themselves. And for now, we'll just talk. We'll see all of you after the election.
On the flip side.
Yep.
It's going to be an interesting time, no matter what.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. These conversations appear on Reason's YouTube channel and the Just Asking Questions podcast feed every Thursday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate and review the show.